Back in 1979, I was a freshman in college at Occidental College in California. And I had had a somewhat rocky youth and teenage years. My father wasn't at home. I was growing up partly with my grandparents in high school. I'd gotten into trouble occasionally, was what my mother called a good time Charlie, meaning I wasn't really serious in terms of my studies, in terms of my work. Had some awareness of the world around me, had some sense of injustice and unfairness, but it wasn't finely honed, it wasn't well developed. And I remember in 1979 arriving as a freshman and doing what freshmen do, trying to figure out what courses are and trying to change your study habits and trying to identify that food in the cafeteria, what it is. And we were visited on campus by a couple of gentlemen from South Africa who were representatives of the ANC in 1979, 1980. And they spoke about their efforts to overcome apartheid. And for about an hour, myself and a group of students listened to these young men who were not much older than we were describe the extraordinary struggles they were going through, the sacrifices that were being made, people who were enduring jail and torture and beatings because they had a sense that somehow, some way, justice would prevail. And that brief meeting, I think, in some ways changed my life, because what it told me, first of all, was that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they're given an opportunity. We sometimes think that our leaders have to have fancy degrees or well-educated or some public office somewhere. These young men had none of those things. But what they possessed was a anger over injustice that they were able to channel in a constructive, positive way. And I thought to myself that they gave me some sense of the direction that my life might go. And so I became active in the anti-apartheid movement on campuses. And I'm not sure we were particularly effective. As I recall, Occidental College continued to refuse to divest despite the various protests that we organized as students. I transferred to Columbia, and there was similar resistance on Columbia's campus. But over time, I like to think that I was part of that mosaic that applied pressure and ultimately helped those in South Africa achieve the extraordinary liberation that I would witness almost 10 years later as a law student. And I remember the image of Nelson Mandela walking out of prison and understanding that a seminal moment in history had occurred and that Mandela's long march towards freedom was not his alone, but was part of thousands of footsteps, of millions of footsteps of people all around the world. And I trace back me getting involved in politics to that moment, because as a consequence of that organizing on a college campus, I became a community organizer. As a consequence of a community organizer, after going back to law school, became a civil rights attorney. As a consequence of being a civil rights attorney, I entered the state legislature, and I now stand before you as a United States Senator and as a candidate for president. And so the primary message I guess I have in receiving this award is that all of you represent enormous potential and enormous possibility for change, because we all know that injustice still exists. It exists here in the United States, in every poor neighborhood, and every inner city, and every rural community all across the country. There is quiet desperation. Young people's lives are filled with sadness and desperation and anarchy and chaos. And obviously all around the world, we see those same symptoms of hopelessness made manifest in places like Darfur, in places like the Middle East, in places that too often are forgotten about and not written about until they flare up in tragedy. So I hope that all of you who are on the brink of doing extraordinary things decide to channel that talent and that energy and that imagination to figuring out how do you move the process along for a better history. How do you put your shoulder against the wheel and move that boulder up the hill? And I'm absolutely confident that if all of you take up that challenge, the world is waiting for you, ready to be changed. Because I think we live in this moment in history right now where the hunger for change, the hunger for something new, the desire to break out of the ordinary, the self-interested, the petty, the trivial, is everywhere. And they're waiting for you. And what makes our relationships so unique is not just proximity. It's our enduring commitment to a set of values, a spirit alluded to by Justin that says no matter who we are, where we come from, what our last names are, what faith we practice, here we can make of our lives what we will. It was the grit of pioneers and prospectors who pushed west across a forbidding frontier. The dreams of generations, immigrants, refugees that were welcomed to these shores. The hope of runaway slaves who went north on an underground railroad. Deep in our history of struggle, said Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Canada was the North Star. The Freedom Road links us together. We're bound as well by the service of those who've defended us at Flanders Field, the beaches of Normandy, the skies of the Balkans, and more recently in the mountains of Afghanistan and training bases in Iraq. And their sacrifice is reflected in the silent rows of Arlington and in the Peace Tower above us. And today we honor those who gave their lives for all of us. We're linked together as well by the institutions that we've built to keep the peace. The United Nations to advance our collective aspirations. A NATO alliance to ensure our security. NORAD, where Americans and Canadians stand watch side by side. And Traxena on Christmas Eve. We're linked by a vast web of commerce that carries goods from one end of this continent to another. And we're linked by the ties of friendship and family. In my case, an outstanding brother-in-law from Burlington. Had to give Burlington a shout out. Our relationship is so remarkable precisely because it seems so unremarkable, which is why Americans often are surprised when our favorite American actor or singer turns out to be Canadian. The point is, we see ourselves in each other, and our lives are richer for it. As president, I've deepened the ties between our countries. And because of the progress we've made in recent years, I can stand before you and say that the enduring partnership between Canada and the United States is as strong as it has ever been, and we are more closely aligned than ever before.